Hello and welcome to the Music Theory Guy Clinic with me, Music Theory Guy. If you've got a question about music theory, this is the place to get it answered. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me an email or you can contact me via Facebook or Twitter. Now that's precisely what YouTuber Steve Walton and Donnie from Malaysia have done. They've written to me and they want to know about SATB, soprano, alto, tenor and bass. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about short and open scores for SATB. Let's have a look. Okay, so before we start talking about short and open scores in detail, let's just be absolutely certain we understand what SATB represents. So the S means soprano, A is alto, T is tenor, and B is bass. They're the four most common types of voices. The soprano is the highest, and the bass is the lowest. Soprano and alto are female, whereas the tenor and bass are sung by males. Now, they're just rough guides to where the ranges that people sing. So, for example, for me, I can sing fairly high. I can get to sort of alto range, but I can't quite get as low as the lowest bass notes. So I've got a range somewhere as shown on screen. You also need to be aware that young boys whose voices haven't broken, they actually sing very high. And we don't call them soprano, we actually call them trebles. So there's lots of different ways to describe different voices. You may have heard of a countertenor, you may have heard of a mezzo-soprano. They're all fine, they all exist, but for this video I'm focusing in on SATB, soprano, alto, tenor and bass. Now here's some music that's been written for SATB, and I'm just going to go through it step by step. So number one, each voice part is on a separate staff or stave if you prefer. And what I mean by that is you can see down the side it says SATB. So the soprano's on the top line, the alto's on the next one down, the tenor's on the next line, and the bass is on the very bottom line. So in other words, if I was singing the bass part, I'd be following the notes on that very bottom line. Number two, all the stems point in the correct direction. Now, what do I mean by correct direction? And I do have a video about stems if you want to go and look at this in a bit more detail. But here's a general rule of thumb. I'm looking at the treble clef stave and I've highlighted the middle line red. Now, if a note is attached to that line, the stem can point upwards or downwards. But if a note sits below that red line, the stem will point upwards. But if the note sits above that line, the stem points downwards. So let's take a close look at the tenor line, what I mean by this. So the first note is a C, which I've highlighted yellow, and because that's above the middle line, the stem is pointing downwards. The next note's a B, that's on the middle line, so I could actually point the stem up or down. I've gone for down, so it matches the downward motion of the C before it. There's the C again, with the stem pointing downwards. The next note is a D, that's well above now the middle line, so that stem is pointing downwards. A B again, that's sitting on the middle line, so I've made the stem point downwards. The A, that's below that middle line, so the stem is pointing upwards. Now I could keep going on for the rest of the tenor part here, but hopefully you get the idea that the stems are pointing in the correct direction, dependent on where they're placed on the stave itself. Have a look at my video on stems, as I say, if you do need a little bit more help with the direction of stems. Number three, the tenor part is written an octave higher than it is actually sung. Now take a close look at the treble clef at the very start of that tenor line. Underneath it you'll spot that there's a little number 8. Now that 8 means sing an octave or 8 notes lower. So have a look at this. We've got the first two notes that are written as C and B. What that means is actually sing it an octave lower. Still a note of C and a B, but an octave lower. Now the reason we do this is to avoid the use of ledger lines. That C and the B, the first two notes of the tenor part, if it was written out as it's sung, you can see that both of those notes have ledger lines. Now to avoid the use of ledger lines, it's just easier to write everything an octave higher. So the tenor part, and only the tenor part, is written an octave higher than it is actually sung. It's worth pointing out that rather than writing a treble clef with a little 8 underneath it, although that's commonplace these days, if you're using an old edition of music, you might come across two treble clefs sitting next to each other. That means sing an octave lower, or you might even find a treble clef with two little lines sticking out of it. That means an octave lower as well. But generally nowadays, you'll come across that treble clef with a little 8 underneath it. And finally, number 4, beats are vertically aligned. Now, what I mean by this is that there needs to be an imaginary line that cuts straight through all 4 lines, which represents beat number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and all the subdivisions of those beats. So here's beat 1, you can see it's a very nice straight line. Here's beat 2, beat 3, and beat 4. In the tenor part, there's a quaver that's on beat 1.5, so there's a nice line that cuts through it there. And you can also see that there's another quaver on beat 2.5, so we've got a nice straight line. Okay, let's shake things up a little bit. I'm just going to move the notes around a little bit just to prove my point here. So here's beat 1, that imaginary line is nice and straight. I need to now write an imaginary line for beat 1.5. You remember that the tenor part, the quaver, that should have been all on its own and it should have been a nice straight line. But because I've written the second beat of the bass part, that D, which I've highlighted, because that's right underneath beat 1.5, I can't draw that line straight anymore. There's a slight kink in it. I've got to go to the left of that second beat of the bass part. If we look at beat 2, it starts off straight, so it cuts straight through the F sharp of the soprano part, but then it has to move to the left to go to the A of the alto, then it goes to the right, so it's to the quaver C of the tenor, and then finally back it goes, that kink, to the left for that D of the bass part. And if we carried on looking at all the other beats and subdivisions of the beat, you can see that it gets quite complex. It is absolutely essential that you write beats vertically aligned when you're writing out music for SATB. There's a long complicated reason for this, but in a nutshell, it's just so that it helps the musicians, in this case the vocalists, be able to understand what all the other musicians are doing, and they're able to place their notes at exactly the right beat or subbeat in the music. Now, these 4 rules are absolutely essential, and what we've actually just written out are the rules for writing music for SATB using an open score. And I'm just going to pop all of our instructions down to the bottom of the screen. So we've got a little bit of space for us to look at short score. So here's a piece of music. In fact, it's exactly the same piece of music as the open score, but this is called short score. And I'll go through the reasons and the explanations of why this is short score. So, number 1, there's only 2 staves or staffs this time. You can see that the soprano and alto are on one line, and the tenor and bass are on the other. Number 2, the soprano and tenor stems point up, whereas the alto and bass stems point down. So let's just have a look at this. So here are all the soprano notes, which I've highlighted red. You can see that all their stems point upwards. Here are the tenor notes, and they're all yellow, and you can see that all the stems are pointing upwards. Whereas the green alto notes, they're all pointing downwards, and the blue bass notes, they're all pointing downwards as well. Now, it's absolutely essential that you follow these rules, but just a couple of things to bear in mind. Here you can see that there is a stem on one black note pointing upwards and downwards. What that means is that if a note has 2 stems, one up and one down, both parts are singing exactly the same pitch. So in this case, the tenor and the bass are both singing that note A. Another thing to bear in mind, a lot of people get confused that they think it's just the highest note on the stave that's the soprano part and the lowest part is the alto. Have a look at this example. You've got a B with the stem pointing downwards and the A with the stem pointing upwards. In this case, the B, which I've highlighted yellow, because the stem is pointing downwards, it's the note that's sung by the altos, whereas the A, which I've highlighted blue, because the stem is pointing upwards, that is going to be sung by the sopranos. So don't always assume that it's the note at the very top that's sung by the sopranos. It's the stem direction that tells you which part is singing which note. Number 3, the tenor part is written at pitch in the bass clef. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves of the tenor part in open score. And you remember that we use the treble clef with that little 8 underneath to represent that the tenor part is written an octave higher than it is actually sung. In short score, the tenor is actually singing from the bass clef. In other words, it's actually going to be sung at the pitch that it's written. So here's the tenor part, and I've highlighted all the notes red. They are going to be sung exactly at that pitch. If you need any help with understanding the relationship between the treble and the bass clefs, go and have a look at my video called The Importance of Middle C. That details that very important relationship between the treble and bass clefs. And finally, number 4, again, just like the open score, beats are vertically aligned. So if we have a look at my short score, you can see that those lines, those imaginary lines, are cutting straight, nice and neatly through each of the beats and subdivisions of the beat. And that's it. So on the screen are the different sets of instructions you need to know when you're reading or writing music for SATB in either the open score or the short score. If you remember these 2 sets of information, you'll have no problem reading from or writing for music that's SATB on the short or the open score. Okay, well I hope that's been useful to you, Steve and Donnie, and anybody else that's been watching. Remember, if any of you have any questions about music theory, please do send me an email or contact me via Facebook or Twitter. I always look forward to receiving your messages. In the meantime, many thanks for watching, and if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel. They want to know about SATB, or Soprano, Alto, Tenor and Bass. In the meantime, many thanks for watching, and if you haven't already done so, who's Sue? I have no idea. Do you know Sue? No, I don't know who Sue is. Who is she? I want to see her now.